Obviously, let's talk about a couple different earthquakes here. Obviously, we saw the horror of Haiti, and much of that horror came about because the building codes. There were no building codes, and complete structures fell down. Japan obviously is in what's called the Ring of Fire, the Ring of Fire around the Pacific Ocean, and they have been building for earthquakes like this for years. That's why when people wake up this morning, and perhaps the number of dead and injured will rise exponentially, but it's going to be nothing like Haiti because they prepare for this whenever they build a building.
Exactly right. If Haiti is in one end zone, if you will, of earthquake preparedness, Japan's in the other end zone. Building codes, but also the organization of the society, what we would call homeland security type arrangements, are probably as advanced in Japan as anywhere. Plus, it's an extraordinarily organized society. Right. If it were to happen anywhere, you almost... I might get this out right, but if it had happened anywhere,
they're the most prepared. 90% of all earthquakes happen in this Pacific Ring. Right. 80% of the biggest happen in this ring, and it's a domestic comparison, so our viewers at home would understand, would be Florida, for instance. After getting hit by Hurricane Andrew, all the building codes were changed. The next hurricanes that came through didn't cause the destruction. And again, Japan has been preparing for this for decades.
Exactly. And to us, it ought to be, as Americans, something also of a warning, not simply for what happens here, the after effects of this, but our own homeland security's domestic preparations for disasters, man-made and natural, are woefully inadequate in this country. And it ought to be something of a wake-up call, not simply, again, for earthquakes, but much more broadly.
Willie, we put up a graphic at the top of the hour, and we don't want to cause hyperventilation. There's a lot of hyperventilation that's going to be going on here. This is, without a doubt, a terrible human tragedy. But as it goes to the West Coast, I don't want people who are up in the middle of the night on the West Coast to believe that they have to prepare for 13-foot waves. We're not talking about that at all in the United States, are we?
In fact, we just had on Dr. Robert Cicero on Way Too Early Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, and I asked him, what should those people on the West Coast be thinking? He said, frankly, stay away from the beaches is about it. You might get some flooding, but this is not going to be waves of water sweeping inland. And as far as Hawaii goes, where they have the larger tsunami warning, he said get to higher ground if you can. But again, you're looking at some major flooding in some areas, but not walls of water sweeping over the island.
And the warning and assessment system for this, with the buoys way out in the Pacific, are going to help everyone prepare. But again, it's tsunami warnings, advisories, and massive flooding, really, that they can be expecting.
This is something that obviously Japan has been preparing for since Wednesday. There will be a small chain of islands, I'm sure, the further east you go, that are going to be, the devastation will be greater the further east you go and the smaller islands that these waves hit. But that being said, by the time it comes to the East Coast, I suspect, like you said, it'll be minimal flooding.
Yeah, we don't want to minimize what's happening in Japan, but we also need to tell the people up watching on the West Coast of the United States not to go into a state of panic about this.
All right. Mika?
They've got a state of emergency at a nuclear plant after a cooling system failure. They say no radiation leak, but this is the latest AP report out.
By the way,
wondering about
By the way, it's very fascinating. As you read through the news script, I noticed that the government said no radiation leak, and you added, they said. Nobody knows if radiation is leaking from Japan. And just again, to put perspective there, and let's let Richard give his perspective, Japan, a significant amount of Japan's infrastructure, energy infrastructure, is run on nuclear power, as much as 25 to 30%.
It's that you always feel Japan's a country that can't catch a break. You've had 2 decades of complete economic drift, no growth whatsoever. You now have this. You've had more governments going through and scandals. They just lost their foreign minister a couple of days ago. This is a country now that just can't kind of get out of the rut and regain its traction. It's come a long way from this country that seemed to be on the verge of such dynamism, threatening America's economic and every position. Here again, it's just a country that can't get on track.
Right.
On the nuclear power plants, the reason I added those words is because looking at the video coming in overnight and monitoring this, there are certain highways that are split in half.
Right.
5 feet wide. I just don't know how you can say there is definitely no damage at the nuclear facilities.
What they are assuming, Mika, is that they have automatic shutdown devices when they have this type of event happening, which they prepare for. If you're going to build a nuclear power plant in Japan, you're going to try to do your best to make sure it shuts down during earthquakes. But you never know. This is a larger event than many people would have expected.
I have a statement from the president about the earthquake in Japan and the tsunami warning. He basically says, I'll just use part of it, we will continue to closely monitor tsunamis around Japan and the Pacific going forward, and we are asking all of our citizens in the affected region to listen to their state and local officials. I've instructed FEMA to be ready to assist Hawaii and the rest of the United States and territories that could be affected.
All right. And, of course, the president, born in Hawaii. Mm-hmm. Don't want to start controversy this morning, but he was born in Hawaii.
Oh, here we go.
Says who? Yeah.
Also, reaching out to Japan, obviously, at this time of need.
Of course, he's going to take care of the home state.
Yes, of course. So, John, I want to follow up on what Richard Haas said. Yeah. Japan not being able to catch a break. And it really does show, I think there's a parallel with China when everybody talks about how China is going to be this rising superpower for the next 100 years. You go back to the 1960s, and Japan looked a lot like China does today. It averaged 10% growth in the 1960s. And then it averaged 5% growth in the 1970s. And then it averaged 4% growth in the 1980s. And they were doing the same thing in the 60s that China is doing now. And then, of course, as Richard said, in the 1990s, they flatlined 1%, and they haven't been able to get out of that rut.
Pat Buchanan is with us.
I wanted to get John's response, and then Pat's. John.
Well, I think it's one of the great stories of American intervention. You know, the building of the post-war Japanese world. I mean, General MacArthur brought democracy there. It's the case we point to where nation building worked.
No doubt about it.
And so there's a historic connection to, and a personal one, in a global world. There are a lot of Americans who have friends and relatives who are there, and very early hours. And so I think we just hope. I don't think I would be skeptical of any statements about the extent of damage at this hour.
There's no way to know. And Pat Buchanan, again, looking at longer historical trends. Japan was the second largest economy in the world from 1968 to last year.
Right.
So we have, of course, we in America are wringing our hands over the possible decline of America's industrial base. That's something they've been doing in Japan for some time, and they have dropped now to number 3 for the first time in 40, 50 years.
Sure, since they took over from West Germany, as you mentioned, in the 60s. But Japan has an endemic problem, Joe. Japan is the oldest nation on Earth, and Japan is literally dying. It's got about 127 million people now, but by the middle of this century, 4 years from now, an estimated 20 to 25 million Japanese will disappear. Its median age is going to go up to 55 years old. It has no immigration, and the dynamism of that kind of society automatically begins to die. And this is one of the problems you see about what you might call Japanese pessimism today, as opposed to the optimism they did have in the 80s and the decades before.
I'd actually put it slightly differently. Japan is quite well off. Per capita income's extraordinarily high, only slightly below ours. It's so comfortable that it's almost impossible to generate domestic political consensus in Japan to undertake reform. If things are good, it's very hard to tell people, take some risks, let's make things better. So Japan is on something what you called, Joe, before, a flat line or even a slight decline, in part because of the demographic reasons. And it's a warning again to us. Because, again, we have to take risks and make some tough decisions in order to improve things. And you don't want to wait until the crisis comes. And that's essentially Japan's challenge. Will Japan be able to reform absent a crisis? For 2 decades now, zero evidence that it's willing to do so. Again, interesting message for the United States.
Once again, an 8.9 magnitude earthquake has hit Japan's northeastern coast at 3 p.m. local time. News in from the Japan Meteorological Agency. They actually have a new system in place which prompts alerts just as an earthquake starts, which may help in keeping the death toll perhaps lower than usual. I don't know it's usual in this case, given the fact that this is the 5th strongest earthquake on record since 1900. The other story that we're following closely pertaining to this is Japan issuing a state of emergency at a nuclear plant after a cooling system failure. They say there are no reports of a radiation leak, but we will monitor that as well. And of course, coastal California is under a tsunami warning and advisory up and down the coast there.
And on the domestic side of things, obviously we're going to be talking about what happened in Wisconsin, what happened on Capitol Hill with Peter King's hearings.
Libya.
More theater than anything. Also, it looks like Gaddafi is getting the upper hand in Libya right now. What is that going to mean, not only for the people for Libya, but for Americans? We're going to talk to Richard about that and a whole lot more.
Much more ahead. Stay with us for continuing coverage of the massive earthquake in Japan. We're also going to get to other news this morning, as Joe said, including Politico's top stories out of Washington. Also, David Axelrod will drop by a little later to be with us on set. But first,
really? He's in the city?
Yes.
He doesn't have a lot to do these days. He's sort of lounging around.
Nothing.